Hi, I'm Alderwoman Sheila Finlayson, and welcome to our Annapolis. I'm very pleased today to have with me Reverend Stephen Tillett, pastor of Asbury Broadneck United Methodist Church. Reverend Tillett has taken on a new role in that he has now authored a book, and this is my copy, the English teacher copy with all the notes, but he's going to tell us today about his book. So, Rev, how did this all come about?
Well, I guess it comes about first because I'm a student of the game. I majored in political science from the School of Government and Public Administration at American U. My father was English and government constitutional law teacher at high school. And so family discussions always revolved around the political establishment, if you will, there's things going on in the world and in the nation. And as I have been observing things over the last, well, my whole life, I guess, but especially recently, I have just become more and more dismayed at the lack of any fact-based process that's used for a lot of policy decisions that come up. They seem to just be more ideology-driven rather than what's best for the people. I mean, you as an alderwoman, you might come with some preconceived notions or positions to your office. But if you're sitting at the table and somebody shows you the hard numbers and says, well, alderwoman, you want to do this, but proper practice or the numbers say we need to do this, then good governance requires you to do what they've suggested. And that in turn would be to benefit more of the people. And that's, for me, that's what public service should be about. How can you do the greatest good for the greatest number? And so when I hear, for instance, in the discussion about changing the health care law, that you have people who are recipients of government health care say, well, I'm ideologically against entitlements. Okay, well, number one, dude, you're getting an entitlement, a list of entitlements as a member of Congress. And number two, so your ideology is more important than 22 million people receiving health care. That's, and I'm not even saying this from a partisan perspective, I'm saying you want to do the greatest good for the greatest number. So the title of the book is Stop Falling for the Okey Doke, How the Lie of Race Continues to Undermine Our Country. And okey doke is flim-flam, it's a scam, it's a hustle, it's a lie, it's foolishness, it's nonsense. And there have been lies that have been perpetuated about the concept, the social concept of race throughout the history of this country that have led us to some very challenging places. Race indeed is a lie. There is one race, that's the human race. There's no discussion about that. Any other differences between human beings is ethnicity. But for people to act as if there are entirely different iterations of creation, that one is this race and another is this race and another, is nonsense. The Human Genome Project, scientists who have forgotten more about genetics than most of us will ever know or understand, have concluded that in our DNA, at the basic DNA level, we are 99.9% the same. This covering is 1/64th of an inch. And as somebody who, in part of my military career, worked in a morgue, I can tell you that when they peel it back, it all looks the same. I know that's kind of graphic, but it's true. 1/64th of an inch. And yet we have become so stuck on stupid, basically, on the 1/64th of an inch, on the less than 0.1% of our DNA, that lie of race, which is false. We are the same race. We're the human race, different ethnicities. But as Condoleezza Rice said, former Secretary of State, that race and racism and whatnot is America's birth defect. Our original sin, some have said, but America's birth defect. And, you know, you can get treated. You can get some treatment for birth defects. And you can go through therapy or whatever, maybe have some surgeries, whatever, and have those addressed. I have a cousin that was born with cerebral palsy, and his right side was shorter than his left side. And as a result of therapy and some surgeries and whatnot, He's done everything anybody else wants to do. Rides a motorcycle, plays football, plays basketball, swim, everything else. But that's because there was intentional decision to address it. Racism and the things tied to it are our birth defect in the United States, and we've just let it linger. And unless we want things to stay the same, if we want things to improve, as I say often in preaching, if you know better, you have to do better. And so it's time for us to do better.
Well, I guess your book is a big step in helping to educate us, everyone,
I hope so,
about what the difference is between racial issues, right, or race and ethnicity. Right. I mean, you cover that pretty thoroughly. I think part from what I recall in reading the book, you talk about the historical significance, the historical foundation that has been laid so that we believe what we believe today, right, which is contrary to the facts that you're describing.
Right, right.
So tell us a little bit about how you gathered your historical context to kind of, I guess, lay the foundation for this presentation to us.
Okay. Well, you know, when you're on the internet and you will see articles of different things, and sometimes I would just kind of save a particular article or segments of it to use later on. You do research on the internet or in the library. And then my oldest daughter gave me, as a birthday gift, probably about 10 years ago, the book by Professor Howard Zinn, Dr. Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. Now, that book is, I think, 690-some pages long. A lot of folks, most people, are not going to read almost 700 pages. That's why this book is intentionally shorter, because I want people who don't usually read. Mm-hmm. They'll say, oh, it's 120-some pages, I can do that. That's one of my members asked me that. I said, all right, Pastor, I don't do a whole lot of reading. How long is this book going to be? And I said, it'll be about 120 pages. He said, oh, okay, I can do that. Mm-hmm. So just looking at, and again, there are so many things that are in writing. So it's not a question of Tillett made this up. This is his opinion. I'm quoting to you what someone else has written or said in the history of the country. So you can't say I made it up. And I know we like to reinterpret things through our modern era political lens. But what they said when they said it. So don't now try to spin it to your liking. It is what it is.
Well, many of my tabs are quotes.
Okay. All right.
And you have several pages where you quote from Dr. King to right, Mark Twain to Einstein.
Kierkegaard, Einstein.
Right,
yes.
You know, where they really, we took it as more like storytelling. Mm-hmm. When they were presenting facts to us.
Indeed.
And telling us how to respond to these facts, but we didn't take it seriously, or we didn't hear it enough or believe it enough. But you've included those quotes, right, to kind of, I guess, reinforce that these are, you know, truisms. Right. You mentioned sci-fi and your pleasure in watching sci-fi. And I used to teach a sci-fi class, and I always told my students, sci-fi is a prediction of what is to come. Mm-hmm. You know, you look back at the book 1984, you know. Right. And so we don't look at much of our history and much of our literature as presenting what's going to happen as a foreshadowing, I guess, of the future. Right. But you've embraced that in your book.
Well, actually, the cover design came to me as a result of a 1970 episode, I know I don't look that old, but I am, of Star Trek, from the original Star Trek series. And this episode 70, I believe, entitled The Last Battlefield. And so you see that the model is half black and half white. And in the episode, the Enterprise encounters a man in space who is running from a police officer, law enforcement officer from his planet, and he is white on one side and left on the other. So eventually the officer comes on the ship, he's white on one side, left on the other. And they're busy beefing about their differences. And one of the Enterprise officers says, but y'all are both the same. And he said, and the officer says, are you blind? I'm white on my right side. He's white on the left, you know, or whatever it was. But again, Gene Roddenberry had that episode to show the nonsensical nature of racial difference. Of ethnic difference, because I really have, and I know racism is a word we use and race are words we use. In the book, I even start off when I state the ground rules, that when you all would say racism, you'll see me use the word ethnicism in this book. When you say race, I'm talking ethnicity. Then the other thing about the cover, if you've ever been to a park or somewhere, or maybe you'll be walking past a corner and you'll see somebody, he's set up a card table or set up a box and he's playing 3-card Monte. And that's what you see here. So he's playing 3-card Monte and he's holding up the Joker. That's basically letting us know we're all suckers, we're all being played. And that's why I entitled it Stop Falling for the Okey Doke, because the whole false concept of race has led to division that has hindered and hampered our nation from its founding. Well, if it's okay, I'd like to just read a short excerpt from a chapter where I'm quoting Dr. King. And everyone, whenever they think of Martin Luther King, they think of the I Have a Dream speech. But Dr. King was so much more than a dreamer. Dr. King was a prophet, and prophets often will poke you where it's uncomfortable. It has been said prophets are here to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And so at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965, he's giving a speech. And what he does is he's teaching and he's unfolding for them how they got to this place of segregation and white supremacy, et cetera, in the first place. And he first talks about, he quotes from C. Vann Woodward's work, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, and references the fact that there were bourbon Democrats who were the business interests of the Democratic Party then, and understanding now that if we were looking at them in 2017, they're now Republicans, because the folks who, many of them who were Dixiecrats back in the day, the segregationist Democrats, you know, after the, or during, I guess, the Nixon era, everybody changed hats. And so some of the progressive Republicans are now Democrats, et cetera. Now, my father had an expression that he used with respect to parties. And Dad would say that the only difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, and I know you're a Democrat, but you'll be okay. The only difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is that the Democrats will usually kiss you first.
That's in your book.
That's in the book. And if you look at the history of the country, I mean, for instance, some people would want to talk about the top 1% and how the tax code and so many other things are skewed toward the wealthy and the top 1%. And there are people, of course, who are a lot younger who don't remember the time when Democrats were in a majority in the Congress, both the House and the Senate, for 40 years, an entire generation. And a whole lot of the tax code was written then. So you can't say, well, this is all the Republicans doing, because again, first of all, folks changed hats in the middle, in the middle of the ride. But secondly, that when the Democrats were in charge, a lot of these policies came into being. So really the harm has come to us from both parties. But what Dr. King did is he's talking about the bourbon interests in the South. They're the business interests. And what they did is they kept an artificially low wage, that the Southern wage was the lowest in the nation. So you had white folks who were working, they're poor, barely making it. And if they dared to complain, the bosses would say, we'll fire you and hire black folk, or I guess colored people then, hire the colors and pay them even less. Eventually, somebody caught on to this okey doke, and you had the populist movement, which emerged, and they brought poor whites and poor blacks, working class folks together and said, you all are both being screwed by the same folks. So rather than beefing with each other, you need to be focusing your attention on them. That's what they started to do. And then here is what Dr. King says in his speech. Again, he's teaching as he's doing this, to let them know how they got there. To meet this threat, the Southern aristocracy began immediately to engineer this development of a segregated society. So it's engineered. It didn't happen, it wasn't organic. It didn't happen on its own. This was intentionally done. Through their control of mass media, they revised the doctrine of white supremacy. They directed the placement on the books of the South of laws that made it a crime for Negroes and whites to come together as equals at any level. So the poor whites, the working class whites, and poor blacks and working class blacks didn't have any problem coming together. They were doing it intentionally to try and improve both of their condition. they engineer the placement of laws to make that a crime. So then King goes on to say, it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. Lyndon Johnson put it this way: if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't know you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him something to look down on. Give him someone, rather, to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. That's the okey doke. And we've been falling for it far too long. And as we have fallen for it, wealthy folk are whistling all the way to the bank.
So what is the message? What is it that we should be doing differently? You know, you mentioned earlier on, as an elected official, I have to rely on, first of all, I'm in my position, not for me, but to serve my community. That's what it's all about. So when I come in with my preconceived notions and someone else comes in with facts and information that's for the greater good, I have a responsibility to consider seriously and implement whatever it is that's going to help the masses. So many of us don't feel that obligation, or we don't trust the information that's presented to us. And so we keep falling for it. We keep falling for it. So how do we help the community to recognize the okey doke when it crosses their doorstep and give them the tools to avoid it, you know, at all costs and do the right thing?
Well, it's going to in part involve a change in perspective on how we interact. Is that when you, as an African American or a Latino, you can't look at every white person you see as opposition. When you're a white person, you can't look at every African American or Latino or Asian American as somehow suspicious. But instead, deal with each person based on who they are as an individual. I mentioned in the first chapter of the book, I talk a little bit about my personal experience. My first pastoral assignment in January 1st, 1990, I'm a brand new rookie pastor, 30 years old, and I'm sent to a majority white, elderly, historically Southern white congregation. That seems like a formula for disaster.
In Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C., Southeast D.C. So these were some of the white folks who had lived there for years and had remained, even though the area around them had changed. And the Lord knit us together like family for 6.5 years. It was a wonderful experience. But what it did is it changed my perspective. You know how, say, when you're walking down the street, you see people walking past you, but you don't really lock in on them. But what happens is, so that if I would say, see an older white person kind of coming, I don't have to lock in on them because I don't know them. After I'm the pastor at Bradbury Heights, I have to lock in on them. I have to lock in on them because they might be one of mine. They might be one of my members, or a sibling, or one of my members, family member, friend who's come to the church or whatever. And so that begins to change my perspective. And then as I'm the pastor to this congregation, and when you're a pastor, you're sharing in some of the most intimate moments in people's lives, from marriage, pre-marriage counseling, counseling in the middle of a marriage if there's difficulty, illness, death, baptism, wedding, all of those things. You are sharing in those intimate moments in their lives, and all of the false barriers that just don't matter fall away. At the end of the first chapter, I talk about a woman from Georgia. Her name was Rose. Actually ran into her son over at the state, her grandson, one of her grandsons over at the state capitol last year. He said, "Reverend, I know you probably don't remember me, but you did my grandmother's funeral." So Rose from Georgia, she was a self-described, "I'm just a Georgia cracker," she would say of herself. After I left the church to come to go to my assignment in Baltimore, there was a time when she got mugged on the street by some punk, you know, probably took her pocketbook. And when she fell, she broke her hip. Her daughters then moved her out of that neighborhood to live with one of them. Well, a few years later, when she passed away, not from that, but when she just passed away from old age, and her daughters took the time to track me down. Now, they could have been angry at every brown person because of what that one person did, but they tracked down their brown former pastor to do the funeral service for their self-proclaimed Georgia Cracker mother.
Now, was that your first?
That was my first pastoral assignment.
Yeah, was that your first funeral? Because
Oh,
you
no,
always
no, no.
talked about your
No, I talked about the first
funeral also.
Right. No, the first funeral was a lady named Sophie Brown, dear, dear, dear woman. When I get to heaven, she's one of the first people I'm looking for.
That's what you said in the book.
And her daughter passed away. Her daughter had not actually been active in the congregation, but she needed me to do the funeral. And when I came to the funeral home to do the service, and she asked me, now I'm there to bury her daughter. She asked me, how you doing? I said, well, I'm a little nervous, actually. And she says, well, this will be good practice for you then. Who says that? But she was just such a wonderful and loving person. And so again, when you get a chance to know people, you know, and you'll have people say, well, I don't want to know them. Well, you need to, because they're in the same boat you're in. They're going through the same challenges you're going through. And in order, again, when you know better, you have to do better. When you understand that a lot of the, quote, race-based stuff is nonsense, is okey doke, then that should require you to make a change, a shift in how you approach things. And when it does, then people of similar circumstance and similar interests can come together to address the political structure, the financial structure, et cetera, the financial industrial complex, the political complex, industrial complex, in order to get improvement for a greater number of citizens. There's a segment in the book where I talk about, there was an article, February 3rd, 2014, Political Blind Spot website, and the title of their article was "The Food Stamp Capital of the U.S. is White and Republican." And they talk about Owsley County, Kentucky, 99.22% white, 95% Republican, population of under 5,000 people, but they, per capita, were the food stamp capital of the country, not somewhere in Chicago, New York, LA, DC, Baltimore, Kentucky. And there are a lot of poor communities in Appalachia and whatnot, and their representative consistently votes against the interests and the programs that support the people who are struggling in his congressional district for whatever reason, because of his ideology or because I'm a Republican, so I can't conceivably support this. Yeah, you can, because your congressional district takes advantage of some of the safety net, some of the entitlements more than any other district in the country. Yes, you absolutely. That's your sacred responsibility. Part of the trust that you occupy when you hold up your hand and say, "I swear to protect, uphold, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God." Okay, so one of the enemies to the domestic is hunger, is starvation, is poverty. It's your job to care for those people, even if it means voting against your ideology. And frankly, if your ideology does not line up with reality, you need to examine your ideology and change it.
Well, you know, what are you talking about? It sounds very much like you're talking about another hot button issue today, and that's healthcare. How many, if you were to do a similar survey on where the greatest need for healthcare, Obamacare, is, I'm willing to bet the results would be very similar. It would be in those communities like in Appalachia, where people are distressed and they don't look like us.
Right.
But their representation doesn't have the same commitment or the same awareness.
Right.
You know, I think that's changing, because you look at on TV at the town hall meetings that they're holding, and folks are coming out. So maybe folks aren't falling for the okey doke as we have in the past, and maybe it takes getting health care that you've never had and then losing it to wake you up. And maybe the same thing will happen with all the other services. Hopefully not.
Right.
But maybe it is a true paradigm shift now, with people being taken, or programs being taken away that the community direly needs.
Right.
I mean,
No, you're making perfect sense. And again, the PBC crowd, the party before country crowd, they're so focused on what's best for their party,
right,
that they are not doing what's best for the country.
right.
And there were a couple of interesting comments. If I have time, I see we're getting the signal, time's winding down. But some of the founders of the country commented on political party. John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, was vice president to George Washington. He says, "There's nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other." So there's no thought there of what's best for the people. It's just they're busy opposing each other. "This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." George Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, said much the same thing, and very pointedly. So the party before country crowd has to be held accountable and understand that it's not about you. It's about us. It's about we the people. And we expect and demand that you will honor your sacred trust to represent all of us, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of whether they're suburban or urban or rural, that you're going to honor your sacred trust to represent and serve all of us. And if you don't, we will vote you out. And that's part of the challenge, is that people at this point are so programmed that some people, they're going to vote Democrat no matter what, and others are going to vote Republican no matter what. You need to vote your interests no matter what. There's a saying in community organizing, we don't have any permanent friends or permanent enemies. We have permanent interests. What are your interests? And are the people that you are putting in office supporting your interests? And if they don't, fire them and hire somebody else who will support your interests and your needs.
Well, I feel like I have to speak in support of my party, and I hope that both parties are doing the same thing. But we've been having a lot of discussions around what our core values are. What really are we here for? What is it that our community needs that we should be all about? Is it about making sure that we have adequate health care? Even though that's in the city particularly, that's not our issue and that we don't provide it. It's a state issue. But adequate housing, adequate transportation, adequate recreational activities and facilities. And that may seem like an amenity, but that relates to good health. It does. So
quality of life.
Quality of life, absolutely. So, we are having discussions to try to get back to the core values that we should be representing for the folks that we represent. So, and I see that we're almost out of time. We could probably talk for another hour. But Rev, what is it that you would like to, for anyone who reads your book, and I hope everyone will, and you're going to tell us in a minute how to get your book, but we'll read this. It's a very enthralling discussion. A lot of what we've all thought, but never put all the ideas and concepts together to say, it's the OKey Doke and we need to stop falling for it. So what is it that you would like for anyone who reads your book to take away from it? And then how can they get it so they can read it?
You need to, in my estimation, I'm asking you, again, when you know better, you have to do better. I'm asking you to find people of similar station and similar concern. Many of them are not going to look like you. Some of them might have an accent. So what? You have similar interests and similar concerns, and get together with them to advocate in your own community and family best interests. The book can be secured on the iUniverse website. That's the letter I and then the word universe.com. And you can put in either my name, the last name is Tillett, T-I-L-L-E-T-T, and it will pull up the book. Or you can put in the word OKey Doke, O-K-E-Y-D-O-K-E, and that will help pull up the book. Or you can go to Amazon.com and get it that way.
And so you're suggesting, it sounds like, that we should be creating book club circles and using this as a information piece to launch into a larger dialogue.
Larger dialogue, and when you have your book club circle, enlarge the circle so that it's people that haven't been in there before.
Exactly.
People that don't look like you, from a different part of town, a different ideology, different party label, whatever, so that you can all join in the discussion. And I promise you there's more that unites you, more that is a similar concern than those things that divide you. Well,
again, it's Stop Falling for the Okey Doke by Reverend Stephen Tillett. And it can be you can find it on Amazon or UPress. iUniversity, I'm sorry.
iUniverse.com.
Or you can reach out to me and I'll connect you to Reverend Tillett if you have trouble with that. But it's an enthralling read. It's very well timed for our society today and full of ideas and concepts that, like I said, we all think about, but never quite make the connection. So I want to thank you, Reverend Tillett. Awesome read, and hopefully you'll be invited to all of our city communities to share your views and share your new book.
I'd be glad to do it.
Thank you.
I appreciate this opportunity.
Glad to have you. Thank you again.